Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue reading A Prophet in Babylon. This is Chapter 5, Dr. Jordan. People who suppose that a human character can be altered radically by sudden emotional experience, however intense, do not understand human nature. Such an experience renders character fluid. Into what shape the molten elements will flow depends on the fiber of a man's will. Many persons, besides St. Paul, have had their visions on the way to Damascus. Some of them, in the cool gray light of the next morning, have dismissed them as hallucinations. Some have believed, but disobeyed. Some have obeyed for a time, but in the end have found the pressure of the world too strong for them. Deliverance from an old and accustomed mode of life is never easy and rarely rapid. When we pull a plant up by the roots, we are astonished to discover how many fibers it has, and with what tendency that very small fiber will cling to the vein of earth in which it is laboriously establishing itself. Moreover, we soon find that it needs a delicate and strong hand for the work. We must slowly and gently loosen the roots, for if we are rough and violent in our methods, we will kill that which we meant to save. Gaunt had experienced a powerful emotion. A new dynamic had been introduced into his life. During the whole of that memorable Sunday, he had literally glowed and thrilled with its novel force. But when Monday morning dawned, physical conditions began to assert themselves. He woke with a leaden pressure on his brain, a languor in each limb, the familiar symptoms of a nervous exhaustion. His elation had died down into despondency. It was very early when he woke, that most doleful hour in great cities, when the day labors to be born, and the city seems to turn on its uneasy bed, reluctant to resume its toils. He heard far off the hooting sirens in the harbor, those harsh voices, raucous and persistent, which goad weary men to new labor. He watched the slow diffusion of cold gray light in the clouded sky, and the gusty, uneven wind seemed to him like the sighing of defeated angels. It was the hour when, for imaginative men, thought is most introspective and reminiscent. As he lay quiet, watching the somber dawn, his whole past life began to march before him in a series of rapidly unfolding pictures. His early life and struggles, its mistakes and errors, the humiliations he had endured through the ignorance and lack of manners, his laborious evolution from the country lad into the scholar and gentleman, he recalled all. He relived all. He figured it to himself as a step and a shining mountain, and steps of glass up which he had toiled with remorseless patience. With what superb confidence he had gone on in spite of failures and rebuffs. He had arrived. There was no doubt of that. He had gained the summit, where people of benignant features moved, and met him with a smiling welcome. And then, with a swift pang of self-pity, he perceived himself slipping backwards on those stairs of glass, and the features of those benignant people on the summit were averted from him in cold scorn and mockery. One thought prevailed over all others at that moment, the thought of Margaret. What did she really think? He knew her loyal, but could she give him that inner sympathy which he most needed at this hour? She would stand by him, of course. That was a thing beyond doubt. But if his whole life was to be changed, if he were now to enter on a new struggle, compared with which all these early struggles were a pastime, would her heart be with him? He recalled their life together. It had begun so beautifully, with all that exquisite tenderness of passion which the poets have sung. He recalled the first time he had kissed her. It was on a winter's evening, as they trod together a path of sparkling snow in a wood, on their way home from skating. The rest of the party had gone on. He and she were alone, and he had drawn her to him and kissed her cold cheek. For a long time after that, he had frantically loved to kiss her cheek when it was cold. During the first months of their married life, much of his romantic and idyllic tenderness had remained. Then it had seemed as though the practical elements of her character had gradually displaced the idyllic. There were fewer occasions of tenderness, as life became fuller of duties for each of them. At first he resented her absorption in household duties. Then he became reconciled to what seemed an inevitable condition of life. He withdrew more and more into himself, and without observing the stages of his process, came more and more to shut her out of his intellectual life. She had never complained. She had been wiser if she had. She also appeared to acquiesce in conditions which seemed inevitable, and had developed into a very practical woman with 100 daily tasks to absorb her. And now Gaunt saw with dismay that he had lost the clue to his wife's nature. He did not know her real mind. He was about to expose her to a tremendous ordeal, and he had nothing to guide him as to her real attitude towards it. At that moment his reverie was broken by the ringing of the telephone, which he kept beside his bed. Dr. Jordan wanted to see him at 9 o'clock. He rose wearily and began to dress. Dr. Jordan was a man just past the middle point of his life, the minister of a neighboring church. He was clean-shaved, with a humorless but firm mouth, bright shrewd eyes, a good forehead, and thin iron-gray hair. He was a man of no great intellectual parts, who never pretended to be anything but a mediocre preacher. He professed a mild kind of heterodoxy, but he really took very little interest in theology. All his energies were devoted to the management of his church, and in this art he was a master. No one knew better than he how to organize the diverse elements of a church into a harmonious whole. He had an instinct which almost amounted to genius for comprehending the exact limits of men, the direction of their thoughts, the scale of their preferences, the direction in which they wished to move. Thus, when he announced any particular policy, it was so nicely timed that his people recognized it as the exposition of their own designs, and justly gave him credit for wise leadership. He did not pretend to any very lofty views of human nature. He was fond of quoting Luther's despondent axiom that you must take men as they are, you cannot change their characters. In times of dispute and difficulty he was fertile in compromise, but his compromises usually had so much practical wisdom in them that no one ever thought of accusing him of a lack of principle. It was by arts such as these that he had maintained for many years, without great intellectual gifts, a position of influence and authority in which such gifts are commonly considered indispensable. Thus he was a man generally trusted and obeyed, sagacious and experienced, a man of suave manners and smooth speech, who rode easily upon the waves of life, and knew better than to expose himself to inconvenient tempests when safe harbors were accessible. Gaunt had had much pleasant fellowship with him. He was a welcome comrade in the golf links, a pleasant guest at the dinner table, a shrewd man of the world, viewing most aspects of life in a spirit of lucid irony, but scarcely a man to whom anyone would go in any deep spiritual emergency. As Gaunt went downstairs to meet him, he guessed the object of his visit. No doubt Jordan had heard something about the sensation caused by the sermon of the previous morning. He had probably come to talk it over. Jordan met with him with his usual humorless smile, and at once proceeded to the business which had made him so early a visitor. "So you've been fluttering with the dovecotes, I hear. Have you seen the morning papers?" "No, I have not. You don't mean to say there's anything about me in them?" "Read them. Here they are." He pointed to the leading New York papers which lay upon the table. Gaunt took them up, and his eyes at once caught the headline, "Sensational Utterances by a New York Minister." He perceived immediately that he was the minister, and that at least 1/3 of the report of his utterances was totally inaccurate. But he soon discovered that in spite of these inaccuracies, whoever had written the report had written sympathetically. If here and there were garbled phrases, which he was sure he had not used, there were others which he recognized, only they seemed to be much more extreme in print than they did in speech. 3 of the reports were alike in the sympathy which they manifested, one of the 3 going so far as to applaud him as a prophet. The 4th was openly hostile and rancorous. It was composed of the worst kind of flippant newspaper wit, clever ironical jeering. "We await developments," it concluded. "We are curious to know what Dr. Gaunt's people have to say of their pastor. He has used the pulpit as a coward's castle to make accusations which he very well knew could not be publicly contradicted. It was an act of insolence as well as cowardice. We can hardly suppose that a church with such a reputation as Mayfield Avenue will patiently endure this new and odious kind of Sunday vaudeville. Well, said Jordan, what do you think of it? You seem to have got yourself into a most unholy kind of mess. Oh, the reports are right enough in the main, said Gaunt, except the last. That is obviously exaggerated and malicious. It's not a question now of accuracy or inaccuracy, said Jordan gravely. The mischief's done. If every line in these paragraphs was false, it would make no difference. You know the old proverb, a lie runs around the world while truth is putting on its boots. The question is what you intend to do about it. What would you have me do? I can't pretend I didn't say these things. I did, and I meant them. I still mean them. Of course I intend to stand by them. Come now, my dear fellow. You're excited and out of sorts. You've been running down nervously a long time. I've seen it if you haven't. Now sit down and let us talk the whole thing over quietly. Any man may make a mistake, but the only mistake that is irretrievable is persisting in a mistake. But I've not made a mistake, said Gaunt, with a vehement gesture. I've spoken truth. Oh, of course, we'll grant that, said Jordan soothingly. You'll excuse my saying it, but any fool can speak what he calls the truth, and accomplish more harm by doing it than if he told lies. All things are lawful, but all things are not expedient. You know who said it. Besides, all truth is relative. And we're going to end there for today, and next week we'll pick up with Chapter 5, Part B, and see what Margaret has to say about things. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.